She called the cops on me for parking on my own driveway. A muddy F-250 sitting on my concrete pad, fully on my property, and Beatrice Bellwether standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, wearing that smirk like she'd already won. When the officer stepped out, she pointed at me and said, "I pay your salary. Arrest him." Right there, I knew this wasn't about a truck blocking her view. This was about power, control, the kind of petty tyranny that crushes good people every single day. But Beatrice made one mistake, one critical miscalculation. She had no idea I'm a major in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. 21 years of dismantling threats a lot more dangerous than a suburban HOA dictator. So, what would you have done? Drop your story below? I read every comment. My name is Hank Peterson. Major U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 21 years active duty. I just transitioned to reserve status 1 weekend a month, keeping my hand in. After 2 decades of living in base housing, moving every 18 months, sleeping in places where mortar fire was the alarm clock, I finally bought my first piece of real land. 5 acres in Maplewood Highlands, Washington. Trees, space, quiet. My wife, Olivia, an ER nurse tougher than half the soldiers I've commanded, was thrilled. Our son was at Annapolis, our daughter studying architecture at the University of Washington. This was supposed to be our chapter. The peaceful one. Every morning, I'd pour black coffee from my French press, step onto the porch, and just listen. The crunch of frost on gravel under my boots. The smell of pine resin mixing with the faint diesel exhaust from my truck. Cold air that didn't taste like sand or burning oil. It was perfect for about 6 weeks. Maplewood Highlands is 50 homes tucked into the hills outside of Tacoma. A mix of retirees and young families with a voluntary homeowners association. No legal teeth. Just a handful of people who liked organizing block parties and arguing about the color of porch lights. And then there was Beatrice Bellwether, 55, vice president of the HOA, married to Roger, a corporate lawyer who was never home. No kids. Lived in the biggest house on the corner lot with landscaping so perfect it looked like it was installed by a robot. Her lawn always smelled like chemical fertilizer, sharp, acrid, the kind that burns your nostrils if you stand too close. And she did these evening patrols where she walked the neighborhood in heels that clicked on the asphalt like a countdown timer. Click, click, click. She was one of those people who used the HOA like a personal kingdom where everything was about property values and community standards. But if you listened close, you realized it was just code. She'd made comments about transient renters, which was code for the Filipino family 4 doors down. And she called the contractor's work van parked on the street clutter. You get the picture. 2 weeks after we moved in, Beatrice knocked on my door with a welcome packet. Smiled, shook my hand, then waited while I flipped through it. She'd highlighted one section in yellow. Vehicles over 6,500 pounds should be garaged or parked behind the fence line. My truck is 6,800 pounds. I looked up and she was still smiling. Just a courtesy reminder, she said. We like to keep things tidy. I nodded, her. Closed the door. Olivia was watching from the kitchen. That woman's going to be a problem, she said. Maybe, I replied. But Olivia gave me that look. The one that says you're too optimistic and it's going to bite you. She was right. 8 weeks in, I came back from a weekend drill covered in mud after running field exercises. Live scenarios, 0 sleep, the kind of training that keeps you sharp. And my truck looked like it had been through a war zone because in a way, it had. I parked it on my driveway, my paved concrete apron 10 feet from the street, completely on my property, and planned to wash it that afternoon. Sunday morning, 7 a.m., Beatrice knocked. I opened the door mid-sip of coffee. That truck needs to be moved immediately, she said, pointing like it was a dead animal. It's an eyesore. I kept my voice level. It's on my property, ma'am. I'll wash it this afternoon. Her face went red, not pink red, and she said, we'll see about that. Then turned and walked away with her heels clicking double time. Monday morning, 6:45 a.m. I'm pouring my second coffee when I see the lights. 2 sheriff's patrol cars rolling up slow and Beatrice standing on the sidewalk pointing at my truck like she's directing an airstrike. That's when the story really starts. The 2 deputies stepped out of their patrol cars and I could see them doing the mental math before they even reached my porch. Young guys, professional, probably mid-30s. The taller one, nameplate reading Officer Mills, spotted the Army Corps of Engineers decal on my truck's rear window, then looked at me standing there in my Army PT shirt. And I watched his shoulders relax just a fraction. He walked up, polite but cautious. "Morning, sir," Mills said. "We got a call about an illegally parked vehicle blocking access." He glanced at my truck, then at the wide-open street, then back at me with this look that said he already knew this was a waste of his time. "On my own driveway," I said, keeping my tone even and friendly. Mills sighed, pulled out his notepad, and walked over to check the property line. Measured the distance from my truck to the street with his eyes. Looked at the concrete pad, then turned to Beatrice, who was still standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed like a school principal waiting for detention to start. "Ma'am, the vehicle is entirely on private property," Mills called over. "There's no violation here." Beatrice's voice carried across the yard, sharp and indignant. "I want a report filed. He's violating covenant standards. This is a voluntary community, and he's refusing to comply." Mills walked back to me, and I could see him fighting the urge to roll his eyes. "Sir, we're going to clear this as unfounded. Have a good day." He handed me a card with the incident number, nodded, and headed back to his car. As they pulled away, I felt that familiar sensation, the prickle of adrenaline at the base of my skull. The same feeling I'd get 30 seconds before a mission briefing when you know the intel's about to get complicated. That evening, my inbox pinged with an email from David Peterson, the HOA president. The body was pure corporate vagueness about community aesthetics. But David had CC'd the entire street, 20 households total. Olivia read it over my shoulder and said, "She's building a paper trail." She was right, so I replied to all, kept it short and factual. Cited my property survey, noted there was no enforceable covenant according to county records, and attached a PDF of my plat map showing the property lines clear as day. For a moment, I let myself imagine this might be the end of it. It wasn't. Next morning, I walked out to grab the newspaper and found an orange traffic cone sitting right at the edge of my driveway. I checked my security camera footage from overnight, and there it was. 11 p.m., a silver Audi sedan pulled up. Roger Bellwether stepped out, placed the cone, got back in, drove off. Took him 40 seconds. I picked up the cone, walked 3 houses down, and set it on Beatrice's pristine porch with a handwritten note underneath. "Believe you dropped this." "H!" Olivia saw me walking back and just shook her head. "You're poking the bear," she said. "Bear poked first," I replied. That afternoon, a county code enforcement truck pulled into my driveway, and out stepped Carlos Espinoza, mid-40s, wearing a county polo shirt and the expression of a man who'd seen every stupid neighbor dispute known to mankind. "Mr. Peterson," he said, "got a complaint about unpermitted grading work on your property. You do any earth moving recently?" I shook my head. "Bought it as is 6 months ago. Haven't touched the grading." Carlos walked my property line, checked the drainage, looked at the slopes, then came back shaking his head. "Man, I'm sorry. This is the 4th bogus call I've gotten from this street this month alone. Somebody's got way too much time on their hands." I offered him coffee, and we stood on the porch for 10 minutes while he vented. And that's when he gave me something I hadn't considered. "You know," Carlos said, lowering his voice, "you can request your own property inspection report from the county for $20. Shows every complaint ever filed against your address going back years. I've seen guys in situations like yours use it to prove harassment patterns if things go sideways." The next week, the anonymous letter showed up in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just a single sheet of printer paper with a message in Times New Roman. "Military types think they're above the rules. Sell and move to base housing where you belong." Olivia found it when she got home from her hospital shift, and I watched her face go from confused to furious in about 3 seconds flat. I took the paper, held it up to the light, and caught the faintest scent of lavender. That distinctive, expensive hand lotion Beatrice wore everywhere, the kind that announces her presence 5 seconds before she enters a room. The following Tuesday, Olivia came home from her night shift at the ER, shaking with a kind of anger I hadn't seen from her in years. Her car had gotten a bogus parking ticket. Then, 3 days later, her hospital received an anonymous phone call reporting that an ER nurse on the night shift was showing up to work intoxicated, and the caller had described Olivia's shift time, her unit, even the color of her car in the parking lot. The hospital had to investigate. Mandatory policy, zero tolerance. And even though Olivia was cleared within hours, the humiliation of being pulled off the floor and questioned in front of her colleagues left her devastated. "She went after my job, Hank," Olivia said quietly. "She called my hospital and tried to get me fired." I felt my jaw tighten in that way it does when I'm making decisions, and Olivia recognized the look immediately. She'd seen it before every deployment, every time I had to shift from husband mode into operator mode. "I need to make some calls," I said. Olivia just nodded, poured herself tea, and said, "Burn her down." I reached out to Captain Mark Jensen, an old JAG buddy. Mark picked up on the second ring, listened to the whole story without interrupting, then said, "Okay, first, your neighbor's an idiot. Second, if she's making false reports to your wife's employer, that's called tortious interference, and you could sue her into next Tuesday if you wanted." But Mark's real advice was simpler. Document everything and create an official paper trail. "File a harassment report with the sheriff, even if nothing comes of it right now," he said. Courts love timelines. If this woman escalates, you'll have dated evidence showing a pattern, and that's gold. Then Mark mentioned something I'd never considered. HOAs registered as nonprofits have to make their financial records public in Washington. Costs like $50 and takes 2 weeks. But I've seen cases where board members were using association funds like personal piggy banks. If there's funny money, that's your leverage. I submitted the request that same afternoon. 2 weeks later, Beatrice called an emergency HOA meeting and pressured David into sending out the notice with exactly 24 hours advance warning, which meant most people couldn't attend. 19 neighbors showed up anyway. For the next 15 minutes, we all sat there watching her click through photos of my truck from various angles, even shots of my security cameras. She argued for implementing voluntary fines of $150 per violation and hiring private security to patrol on weekends. I was sitting in the back row, arms crossed, just watching her perform. And I'll admit, there was a small part of me that was impressed by the sheer commitment to pettiness. About halfway through, Marcus Thomas raised his hand. He's a mail carrier, early 50s, lives 4 houses down. "Beatrice," Marcus said, voice calm but firm. "This feels personal. His truck's parked on his own property. Why do we care?" Beatrice's face went tight. "Because people like him don't respect community standards." And the way she said "people like him" landed in the room like a grenade. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Olivia and went through the HOA financial records that had arrived 3 days earlier. It didn't take long to spot the problems. Beatrice had been billing administrative expenses totaling $9,200 over 18 months. Receipts were vague as hell. One entry jumped out immediately. $500 paid to Rogers' law firm for Covenant review services. Olivia, who'd spent 15 years managing ER budgets, circled 3 entries in red pen. "This is self-dealing," she said. "Nonprofits can't pay board members or their families without full board approval and disclosure. If she didn't get a vote on this, it's fraud." The next morning, Marcus caught me at the mailbox and walked over. "I've lived here 9 years, Marcus said finally. "Beatrice has run off 3 families that I know of. Always finds a reason. Noise complaints, property maintenance, whatever. But it's never the white folks, you notice that?" He told me she'd filed noise complaints against him for loud music, even though he just listens to NPR on a clock radio. She'd called animal control on the Filipino family, claiming their Chihuahua was a vicious dog. I couldn't sleep that night. So, around 2 a.m., I found myself at the kitchen table with my laptop, digging through public county records the way I used to dig through intel reports, looking for patterns nobody else had noticed. I started with Beatrice and Roger's address, pulled up their property record, and sat staring at the screen for a full minute trying to process what I was seeing. $55,000 in unpaid property tax liens going back 2 years, with foreclosure proceedings that had been paused due to a hardship application they'd filed 6 months ago. I cross-referenced with court records and found a malpractice settlement from 10 months earlier where Rogers' law firm had paid out. $250,000 to a client they'd screwed, over in a real estate deal. And suddenly, the whole picture snapped into focus like a surveillance photo coming into resolution. Beatrice wasn't obsessed with property values because she cared about the neighborhood. She was terrified that her own financial collapse would drag down home prices and expose her as a fraud. Every single complaint she'd filed, every petition she'd circulated, every meeting she'd called was just her projecting her own failure onto everyone else. It was almost sad, really. The way people in freefall will grab at anything around them and try to drag others down, just to feel less alone in their descent. I'd seen it overseas in corrupt officials who'd abused their power right up until the moment everything collapsed. And sitting there in my kitchen with the refrigerator humming in the background, I realized Beatrice was no different. Just operating on a smaller, more pathetic stage. The following week, I started making small, deliberate moves designed to remind Beatrice exactly whose property she was staring at every morning. I parked my truck prominently in the driveway every single day, washed and waxed, so it gleamed in the sunlight like a monument to the fact that I wasn't going anywhere. I installed a flagpole in my front yard, perfectly within code, and flew an American flag that I raised at dawn and lowered at dusk with the kind of military precision that turned a simple flag into a statement. I even added a decorative boulder near the property line, one of those big landscaping rocks that costs $400 and requires a small crane to place, positioned so it was perfectly visible from Beatrice's kitchen window every morning. Every single thing I did was completely legal, properly permitted where necessary, and designed to assert one simple fact. This was my property. I'd earned it through decades of service, and no amount of petty harassment was going to move me. Within 3 days, I could see her pacing her driveway on the phone, gesturing wildly, her voice carrying across the street in sharp, angry fragments that I couldn't quite make out, but didn't need to because the tone said everything. Olivia watched from our porch one evening while I grilled chicken and said quietly, "You're poking the bear." I flipped a chicken breast and replied, "I'm giving her rope." And we both knew what I meant. Because desperate people don't de-escalate when they're cornered. They double down. They thrash. They make the kind of mistakes that turn a quiet neighborhood dispute into something you can take to court. And I was counting on every single one of them. The week before the scheduled HOA meeting, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. like always, started the coffee, walked outside to grab the newspaper, and immediately knew something was wrong. My truck was sitting lower than it should have been. All 4 tires slashed, clean cuts through the sidewalls, the kind of damage that's deliberate and personal and costs about $1,000 to fix. I stood there in my driveway in bare feet and sweatpants, the morning air cold enough that I could see my breath, and felt that old familiar anger rising up. Not the hot explosive kind, but the cold, calculating kind that comes from years of dealing with threats and knowing exactly how to dismantle them piece by piece. I pulled out my phone, reviewed the security camera footage, and there it was, 2:17 a.m. A figure in a dark hoodie approaching from the street, kneeling by each tire, working quickly, then disappearing back the way they'd come. The footage was clear enough to see the person's height and the way they moved, but the face was obscured, and the lighting made it impossible to identify them definitively, which meant whoever did this knew where my cameras were and had planned accordingly. I filed a police report within the hour. Deputy Mills showed up looking tired and frustrated. He watched the footage on my laptop, made notes, and said what I already knew he'd say. Height and gait are consistent with your neighbor, but without a clear face shot or other evidence, we can't make charges stick. You need more. I handed him a printed timeline of every incident over the past 4 months. The false police calls, the anonymous letter, the hospital complaint against Olivia, and watched him flip through it. "Keep this documentation," he said. "If she escalates again, and I think she will, you'll have everything you need for a restraining order at a minimum." 3 days later, the smear campaign started, and I'll admit I didn't see it coming because I'd underestimated how desperate Beatrice had become. Someone created a fake Facebook profile called Concerned Maplewood Resident and started posting in the neighborhood group claiming that a new neighbor was an aggressive military type who threatened families, surveilled children with cameras, and had a history of violent behavior. The posts were vague enough to avoid direct libel, but specific enough that everyone knew they were talking about me. Olivia's ER colleagues were even tagged. That evening, my son called from Annapolis, and I could tell he was trying to sound calm, but there was an edge in his voice. "Dad, someone tagged me in a Facebook post saying you're threatening people. What's going on?" I explained the situation as clearly as I could. Told him about Beatrice's escalating harassment and the fake profile, and he was quiet for a moment before saying, "You always told me to document everything and let the truth speak for itself. Are you doing that?" I smiled despite everything. "I am," I said. "And when this is over, I'm going to show you exactly how we handled it. Because someday you're going to deal with someone like this. And you need to know that you don't fight lies with anger. You fight them with facts and patience and the willingness to let your enemy destroy themselves." The special HOA meeting was in 2 days, and I'd completed my dossier. Timeline, photos, financial records, witness statements, everything spiral-bound and ready to distribute. And somewhere across the street, I knew Beatrice was preparing her own defense, probably printing out her own packets filled with accusations and deflections, not realizing that she'd already lost the moment she'd decided to fight facts with feelings. 2 days before the meeting, David sent out an email at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night with the subject line, "Meeting postponed indefinitely." I read it twice, felt my jaw tighten, and immediately called David's cell phone. "David, who told you to cancel the meeting?" I asked, keeping my tone level and professional. There was a long pause. "Beatrice said there were legal concerns," David finally stammered. "Roger reviewed the bylaws and advised that we might be exposing the board to liability." I cut him off. "David, the bylaws require you to hold a special meeting within 14 days of receiving a valid petition signed by 20% of homeowners. We gave you 11 signatures, which is 22%. If you don't hold this meeting, any homeowner can sue the board for breach of fiduciary duty. And I've got an attorney on standby who'd love to take that case." This was a bluff, but David didn't know that. "Fine," he said quietly, defeat heavy in his voice. "Thursday, 7 p.m., Community Center. I'll send out the corrected notice in the morning." Thursday arrived with the kind of nervous energy that reminded me of pre-mission briefings. By 6:30 p.m., the community center parking lot was already filling up. 43 of the 50 homeowners had RSVP'd that they planned to attend. As I walked toward the entrance with Olivia beside me and Marcus, Gil, and Yolanda a few steps behind, I could feel the weight of what we were about to do settling over me like the gear you put on before a patrol. Heavy, necessary, and impossible to take off until the job is done. Inside, the room smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. Beatrice had arrived early and set up a table at the front of the room with stacks of her own packets, printed on expensive paper with color-coded tabs. The kind of desperate over-preparation that signals someone who knows they're about to lose. She was wearing a navy blazer and pearls, her hair perfect, her makeup carefully applied. Roger sat beside her, looking uncomfortable, scrolling through his phone. Deputy Mills was there too, standing in the back corner in uniform because I'd requested a sheriff's presence for security, which was code for, "I want an official witness to everything that happens tonight." David called the meeting to order with a trembling hand on the gavel. "This special meeting has been called to address concerns raised by multiple homeowners regarding board governance and financial management." He looked directly at Beatrice. "Miss Bellwether, as the petitioner who called for enforcement actions, you have the floor first to present your position." Beatrice stood, smoothed her blazer, and launched into a prepared statement about volunteer board members who work tirelessly for the community, only to be attacked by newcomers who don't understand the neighborhood's values. And I watched her perform with a kind of detached fascination, the same way I'd watched enemy combatants try to justify their actions during interrogations. Marcus stood up from his seat in the middle row before Beatrice had even finished her second paragraph. "Point of order," Marcus said loudly. "She's lying, and everyone in this room knows it." The room erupted in scattered gasps and murmurs. Beatrice's face went from pale to red in the span of about 3 seconds. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising to that pitch that happens when someone's losing control. I am a volunteer board member who has dedicated— Marcus cut her off. You've dedicated 4 years to harassing people who don't fit your idea of what this neighborhood should look like, and we're done pretending otherwise. David looked at me helplessly. I stood up, calm and deliberate, and said, Mr. Chairman, you called this meeting for me to have the floor. I walked to the front of the room carrying a cardboard box filled with spiral-bound dossiers and started handing them out row by row. The room watched in complete silence, broken only by the sound of pages being flipped and the occasional whispered, "Oh my God," as people started reading. My name is Major Hank Peterson, U.S. Army Reserve, I said, standing at the front with my hands at my sides in that relaxed parade rest posture that's become automatic after 2 decades in uniform. I've spent 21 years serving this country, and I moved to Maplewood Highlands 6 months ago because I wanted peace and quiet after spending most of my adult life in war zones. Instead, I've been systematically harassed. My wife's career has been threatened, and my property has been vandalized. All because one person decided that my truck and my job didn't meet her standards. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the projector screen behind me lit up with the first slide. A timeline starting with Beatrice's welcome packet and the highlighted vehicle restriction. Running through the false police calls, the code enforcement complaints, the anonymous letter, the hospital report about Olivia, and ending with photos of my slashed tires from last week. This isn't about community standards, I said, advancing to the next slide showing the fake Facebook posts. This is about abuse of power. The room was dead silent now. Everyone reading their dossiers and looking up at the screen and then looking at Beatrice, whose face had gone from red to white. I advanced to the financial records slide, the one showing $9,200 in unexplained administrative expenses and the $1,500 payment to Rogers' law firm. The HOA bylaws require board members to disclose any payments to family members and get a conflict of interest vote from the full board, I said. According to the meeting minutes posted online, no such vote ever occurred. Which means Miss Bellwether has been funneling association funds to her husband's failing law firm without authorization. Beatrice's voice cracked when she tried to respond. This is slander. Roger, do something. But Roger just sat there looking at his phone, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and resigned. Beatrice, stop talking, please. Just stop talking. The room erupted in whispers and conversations. I held up my hand, and the room quieted down again. I filed a formal complaint with the Washington Secretary of State's nonprofit division this morning, I said. They'll be conducting an audit of the HOA's finances, and if they find what I think they'll find, there will be consequences. But that's not why we're here tonight. I turned to face the room instead of Beatrice. We're here because you elected a board to serve this community. And instead they've been serving themselves and using HOA rules as weapons against anyone they don't like. Marcus has been harassed. Gil has been harassed. Yolanda has been harassed. The Montemayor family down on Spruce Street has been harassed. And it stops tonight. I paused. I move for an immediate recall vote of the entire board, effective immediately, with new elections to be held within 30 days. A woman in the third row I'd never met before raised her hand. I second that motion. David looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but he went through the procedures mechanically, called for discussion, and when nobody spoke, he called for the vote. All in favor of recalling the current board? 38 hands went up. Beatrice stood abruptly, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the door with Roger following behind her. And the sound of the metal door slamming echoed through the community center like a gavel striking wood, final and irreversible. After the meeting ended and people started filtering out into the parking lot, I found myself standing with Olivia, Marcus, Gil, and Yolanda under the streetlights, all of us tired but smiling. A reporter from the local paper snapped a photo of us, and I knew that photo would run on the front page of the local section. And I hoped it would inspire at least one person dealing with their own petty tyrant to stand up and fight back. 6 months after everything settled down, my son graduated from Annapolis, and at the ceremony he pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. Dad, remember when Beatrice was posting those things about you online? You told me that courage isn't loud. It's methodical and patient, and lets the truth do the talking. I think about that every day now. That might have been the proudest moment of my life, knowing that dealing with a nightmare neighbor had somehow taught my kid a lesson about integrity that he'd carry into his career as an officer. My truck sat in the driveway, washed and waxed. And nobody said a word about it because it wasn't a problem anymore. It was just a truck. And that's exactly how it should have been from the beginning. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Olivia and I were cleaning up the kitchen, she asked if I'd really meant what I told the reporter about anyone being able to do what I did. And I thought about it while drying a plate. Yeah, I said. The only special thing I brought to this situation was stubbornness and a filing system. Everything else, the public records, the bylaws, the documentation, that's all available to anyone willing to do the homework. She smiled and kissed my cheek. You know, Gil's neighbor 2 streets over is dealing with something similar now. Developer trying to use eminent domain to force him off his land for a strip mall project. I raised an eyebrow. Is that so? I said. And Olivia laughed because she knew that tone. Knew I was already mentally reviewing what I knew about eminent domain law and thinking about who I could call for information. You can't help yourself, can you? She said. I shrugged. Somebody's got to stand up to bullies. Might as well be someone who knows how. So, if you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare right now, the board member who thinks they run the neighborhood, the busybody who files complaints about everything you do, the petty tyrant who uses rules as weapons, drop your story in the comments below. The worst one gets featured in next week's video, and maybe we can help you find a solution. Because nobody should have to live in fear in their own home. And if you love watching bullies get outsmarted by people who refuse to back down, hit that subscribe button, because I've got more stories like this coming every Tuesday. Remember, quiet professionalism beats loud tyranny every single time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.